talking to your community, and it's just very sad that it was under such tragic circumstances, especially as the rabbi said, we were planning to have some learning together anyway. We didn't imagine that it would be under these circumstances. So I'd like to share with you some thoughts about Rabbi Sacks as a person, as a thinker, and as a mentor. I don't know if any of the people here in your community, Rabbi Adam, had the pleasure of meeting him or knowing him. I know that he was very, very widely read by Jews all over the world, especially in the English-speaking language. His facility with English, his eloquence and his elegance in the English language were quite a remarkable feature of his teaching, both as a speaker and as a writer. And I'm sure that that adds to his appeal in the English-speaking world. And I know that his Covenant and Conversation series, which has come out in a number of books, but was also a weekly post on the Parsha for many years. I know that that touched a lot of people, even beyond the reach of his books and the Sidurim and the Machzorim and all of the other scholarly works that he. I mean, it's quite remarkable that in the previous 28 years, he published 28 books. As Rabbi Adam said, I'm on my second book, but 28 over 28 years is really quite a remarkable thing. I want to start by telling you something about Rabbi Sacks that I think may surprise people who didn't know him, but won't be surprising to anybody who did in a personal capacity, which is that he was a remarkably shy person. So shy, in fact, that it was almost inhibiting. One-on-one conversation with him could be very difficult because that's how things are with very, very shy people. Conversation often doesn't flow. And it was a remarkable transformation when he would move from maybe somewhat stilting one-to-one conversation to speaking in front of a crowd of hundreds or even thousands of people. And his sparkling charisma and his gleaming oratory would really create a kind of sense of wonder in the audience, especially just before he spoke. There was always a tremendous sense of great apprehension, not apprehension, what's the word? I can't think. People were just the kind of the expectancy, that was the anticipation in the air would always be heavy before he spoke. But the shyness is important because a large part of what Rabbi Sacks was about, and I'll talk more about this as I unfold the thoughts I want to share with you, but a large part of what Rabbi Sacks was about was responsibility, duty, and ethics. And a main reason why he became a rabbi was out of a sense of responsibility. In a sense, there's a sense in which the job was not a natural fit for him, because a rabbi has to put himself out there the entire time, launch oneself into conversations. There's someone new at the back of the shul. You're supposed to go over and say, hi, how are you? And schmooze with them. And that's not kind of a natural mode of behavior for someone who's shy or introverted. However, I think Rabbi Sacks was led to conclude by people who he trusted that he really had some tremendous talents that the Jewish people needed. And therefore, even though he had to move out of his comfort zone constantly in order to be a rabbi, it was a duty and a responsibility. In many ways, I think the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I will come back to this towards the end of the talk, was responsible for helping Rabbi Sacks to see how important it was for him to be involved in Jewish leadership. He tells a story, you may know, that he was in his first Yechidus, in his first one-on-one meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1968, in the summer of 1968. And the Rebbe asked him, how many Jews are there at the University of Cambridge, which is where Rabbi Sacks was then a student. And Rabbi Sacks said roughly 1,000 Jewish students. And then the Rebbe asked him, well, how many Jewish students get involved over the course of a semester in the operations of the Jewish Society, which is kind of like the Hillel in Britain? And Rabbi Sacks said roughly 100. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, what are you telling me, Jonathan, that only 10% of the Jews at Cambridge are getting involved? What are you doing to remedy that? And Rabbi Sacks, he as he would recount this story, he would tell what a British or English sentence it was that he tried to form in response to the Rebbe's questioning here. He started a sentence with the following words: Rebbe, in the situation in which I find myself. And before he could complete the sentence, the Lubavitcher Rebbe interrupted him and said, Jonathan, people don't find themselves in situations, they put themselves in situations. And the Rebbe, I think, was coaching Rabbi Sacks always to take responsibility, even for things that you wouldn't naturally take responsibility for. Years later, after he finished his rabbinic training, but had decided to go back into academia or some other profession, he wrote to the Rebbe that he wanted help to decide between being an academic philosopher, being an economist, or being a lawyer. And the Rebbe crossed out all three because the Rebbe saw in Rabbi Sacks something that Rabbi Sacks didn't yet see in himself, which was this great, powerful intellect with depths of compassion, human compassion, and an ability to articulate Jewish ideas in ways that would give them new and wide appeal. So Rabbi Sacks was kind of prodded into the rabbinate in a sense against his nature. A similar story is when the vacancy for the chief rabbinate came up. Rabbi Sacks's name was being thrown around, but he had to actually agree to be nominated. And again, he wrote to the Rebbe and he said, dear Rebbe, should I take the job if I'm offered it? And the Rebbe apparently took Rabbi Sacks's words and just put some arrows upon it to reorder the words in the sentence, so it would come out reading, Dear Rebbe, I should take the job if I'm offered it. And you can see, I think, from these anecdotes, the extent to which the Rebbe was fundamental in the chief rabbi's career trajectory. But another thing that was tremendously important to him was his wife, Lady Elaine Sacks. Unlike Rabbi Sacks, I mean, Lady Elaine is a relatively quiet person, but unlike Rabbi Sacks, I think she found kind of communal socializing, let's put it that way, much easier, or fraternizing, much easier than Rabbi Sacks did. And she gave Rabbi Sacks tremendous confidence. You very often will see a speaker, an international speaker will come, in the days before coronavirus, would come to be a scholar in residence, perhaps in your shul or some other shul, and they wouldn't necessarily come with their spouse. Rabbi Sacks very rarely went anywhere without Lady Elaine, because she gave him, as I say, a tremendous support, confidence, courage. And Rabbi Sacks said something to me when I got engaged, that was engaged to get married it would have been in 2005. It was really meaningful to me. In fact, one of my rabbis, who I'm still close with, and he's a wonderful man, but he's a deeply cynical man, said to me, oh, enjoy marriage in the early days. He said, marriage is like a lovely hot bath. You get in it and it's just so relaxing and wonderful. But as time goes by, it cools down. Eventually it gets cold, but you can't leave, because by that time, if you get out of the cold bath, you're going to catch hypothermia. It'll be freezing outside the cold bath. That's what one rabbi told me about marriage when I told him I was engaged. Very nice. Not a pastoral rabbi, by the way, not a pulpit rabbi. This is a yeshiva rabbi. Anyway, Rabbi Sacks told me the day I told him that I was getting engaged, it was the diametrically opposite attitude. He said, Sam, I want you to know that the beginning of a relationship is a very exciting time, but there's no reason on earth why it ever has to change. And I think that was a tremendous insight into Rabbi Sacks's marriage. I think Rabbi Sacks, his love, their love for one another, retained the depth, the passion, the intensity that some people only have at the, in the first flushes of romance. And I actually think that that's part of why Rabbi Sacks had such a tremendously intimate relationship with God. Rabbi Sacks's relationship with God was personal, and there's no other way to describe it. And sometimes when you were in the presence of Rabbi Sacks, you felt you were in the presence of majesty or in the presence of a deeply godly person. But I think the reason for that was because he lived his life in the presence of majesty. He had an intimate relationship with God. And it's hard for me to think that these things are unrelated. I think that being blessed with a powerful, meaningful, loving relationship interpersonally between husband and wife was almost a necessary aspect of a life that has room in it for an intimate relationship between man and God. It's almost like marriage is a tutorial for the relationship between a person and God. Okay, so what I wanted to do in the time remaining is I wanted to share with you one of the many kind of deep principles of Rabbi Sacks's outlook that shaped me. And then I want to speak briefly about some of the personal interactions I had with him, some more of the personal interactions I had with him. And so the first thing I want to share is this notion that's very, very clear in Rabbi Sacks's work, which I would call the centrality of the ethical. And he takes this notion to quite radical extremes. In his series on covenant and conversation, in fact, this is in the in one of those that was kilu, so to speak, canonized in the OU Maggid collections of covenant and conversation. On the first parsha of the Torah, Parshat Bereshit, Rabbi Sacks discusses the question as to what genre the Torah belongs to, what genre does the Tanakh belong to. It's actually a crucially important question for a variety of philosophical issues in the philosophy of Judaism, including in some of the things that I've worked on. Because before you're able to know what the message of a book is and what it's legitimate to learn from a book, you have to understand what genre the book belongs to. Those two tasks are related. So Rabbi Sacks asks, to which genre is the Torah is a contribution? And he writes, Torah is not a book of history, even though it includes history. It is not a book of science, even though the first chapter of Genesis is the necessary prelude to science. And what he means by saying that the first chapter of Genesis is a necessary prelude to science is that in human intellectual history, at least the biblical story tells us that monotheism came first because Adam and Chava were monotheists, but certainly in recorded history, we know of polytheism before we know of monotheism. And what polytheism encourages is a certain chaotic outlook upon the world. You see, if there's a different God governing the laws of water, let's say, from the God who governs the laws of fire, then there's no reason to think that there should be one coherent and consistent set of natural laws that govern everything. Now, that assumption, the assumption that there is one coherent and consistent set of natural laws that govern everything, that govern not just our human physiology, but also the creation of stars on the other side of the galaxy, one coherent and consistent set of laws responsible for explaining all of that, it would be almost a miracle for a polytheist to come to that insight. But once you agree with the opening words of Sefer Bereshit, that the entire universe is the product of the creative will of one intelligent being, then you can start going with science, and you can start making sense of your assumption, the foundational assumption of science, an assumption that science can't prove but must operate with, the assumption that the universe itself is somehow intelligible rather than capricious. So Rabbi Sachs was willing to say that the Tanakh is important to the scientist. It marks a necessary prelude to science, but the Torah is not a book of science. So it's not a book of history, nor is it a book of science. I'll continue the quote. He says, rather, it is first and last a book about how to live. Everything it contains, not only mitzvot, but also narratives, including the narrative of creation itself, is there solely for the sake of ethical and spiritual instruction. Now, I think that's a tremendously radical position for the rabbi to adopt. And I don't think he was overstating his position. I think he truly believed that every single detail of the Torah has to be mined for ethical and spiritual instruction. Even, let's say, the genealogies, right? So-and-so begot so-and-so. Until we have figured out how a verse is supposed to shape our lives and our deeds, then according to Rabbi Sachs, we haven't plumbed its depths. So ethics is for Rabbi Sachs the beating heart of Judaism. And as Rabbi Klein says in the comments there, thank you, Rabbi Klein, this has a major impact in terms of what we mean by biblical truth claims. That's absolutely right. You see, the belief that God wrote the Torah word for word is very, very important, but it's kind of incomplete. We need to know what kind of book it is. You know, did God write a fiction? Right? Did God write a novel? Did God write a poem? Did God write, what was it that God was writing? And now, even if it was a fiction, you can learn things from fiction. For instance, from science fiction, you can learn all sorts of things about the human condition. From historical fiction, you can learn things about what actually happened historically if you're a sophisticated reader and you're able to recognize which parts of the fiction are intended as the historical backdrop and which parts of the fiction are intended only as the fictional narrative. So yes, you can't really assess the Torah for its truth claims until you've got sorted what genre the Torah belongs to. And according to Rabbi Sachs, first and foremost, the Torah is a book of instruction, which is what the word Torah means. And more than that, every detail, he says, is solely there for the sake of our ethical and spiritual instruction. Now, this you might think is going to be a difficult view to sell, because there are parts of the Tanakh which don't strike our modern ears as all that ethical. I mean, there's genocide in the Tanakh, and there's, ethics of war in general with which we may not be all that comfortable. Certain elements of the distribution of power and rights between men and women in the biblical narrative might not strike us as tremendously ethically enlightened. But Rabbi Sachs is undeterred. Everything that ethics are the beating heart of the Torah. And what I want to focus on in order to unpack this further and to see how Rabbi Sachs meets some of the challenges that are going to emerge for this view, is he had, I wouldn't say it was a revolutionary view, because I think it's there in the Rishonim, and I think he's actually drawing on the Rashba, Shlomo Ben Aderet. But the view that I'm about to articulate, I think Rabbi Sachs, and I even think it's the pshat, I think it's the simple truth of the matter, what I'm about to explain to you, but I think Rabbi Sachs brought it into the 20th and 21st century. And it's an understanding, what I'm talking about is an understanding of a series of Jewish laws called Darkei Shalom. Now, Darkei Shalom are laws that govern the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, Jews and Gentiles, But it's not merely Jews and Gentiles. It becomes clear, perhaps clearer than it does in the Talmud, is in the Tosefta, in Tractate Gittin. It becomes clear that these laws are supposed to regulate the way that Jews behave, not just to regular Gentiles, but even to idol-worshipping Gentiles, of the Avodah Zorah. So I'll quote in English what the Tosefta teaches. It says, if a city has both Jewish and idol-worshipping residents, then the charity collectors should collect from Jews and idolaters because of Darkei Shalom, and they should sustain with those funds the poor idolaters alongside the poor Jews because of Darkei Shalom, and they should eulogize and bury the dead idolaters because of Darkei Shalom, and they should comfort the mourners among the idolaters because of Darkei Shalom. Now, that's the end of the quote from the Tosefta. There's no doubt that the Tanakh itself, the Bible itself, imposes an obligation upon Jews towards Gentiles only if those Gentiles renounce idolatry. But here, the rabbis in the Tosefta are saying, no, even if they're idol worshippers, bury their dead, visit their sick, comfort their mourners, feed their hungry. Rabbi Sachs addressed these laws, and he compared and contrasted Darkei Shalom, which means the ways of peace, with what he called prophetic peace, the peace that will emerge in the end of days, the peace that the prophets of Israel foresaw. Now, in prophetic peace, it tends to be predicated upon the universally shared monotheism that's going to emerge in the end of days. V'haya bayom hahu, right? It shall be on that day that God will be king over all the earth. And on that day, the Lord will be one and his name will be one, as we say at the end of the Aleinu prayer from the prophet Zechariah. But says Rabbi Sachs, in these days, before the coming of the Messiah, we're not supposed to live with prophetic truth, prophetic peace, the peace that you only extend to fellow monotheists. We're supposed to live according to the laws of Darkei Shalom, the ways of peace, which extend love even to idol worshippers. Now, why? You might think it's because, look, it's politics. We're in exile and we're subject to the rule of Gentiles, such that we don't want to provoke their hatred. Now, Rabbi Sachs, along with the Rashba, and unlike other Rishonim, he forcefully argued that this is the wrong explanation. There is a category of Jewish law directed towards the prevention of enmity. Enmity within the Jewish community, which is, for instance, why we have a set order for calling people up to the Torah, so that we don't get into fisticuffs in shul every Shabbos morning or every Monday and Thursday, right? It's a law to provoke the rise of enmity. And also this category of laws about the prevention of enmity also include laws to reduce enmity between Jews and Gentile. But those laws, they always take a negative form. Don't do such and such, mipnei eva, meaning don't do such and such because it will provoke enmity. That is to say, those laws are all framed in negative terms, in terms of what we shouldn't do, unlike the laws of Darkei Shalom, which are all positive, framed in terms of what we should do. We should visit the Gentile sick, we should bury their dead, we should comfort their mourners. Moreover, the rabbis are very clear about their motivations. When the laws are about enmity reduction, they say so, and they say these laws are mipnei eva. But the laws we're talking about are explicitly motivated not in terms of the reduction of enmity, but mipnei darkei shalom. So in other words, the rabbinic obligation upon Jews to care for Gentiles, irrespective of their beliefs, the duties motivated by darkei shalom, are not some two-faced political compromise. So what are they? And they seem to be in conflict with the Bible. According to Rabbi Sachs, the obligations of Darkei Shalom emerge because nobody can be held particularly culpable today for their failure to see the truth of monotheism. We should try to spread the truth of monotheism by peaceful persuasion wherever possible, but until the coming of the Messiah and the overwhelming evidence of God's presence that will emerge in those days, the love of peace and justice, which stands at the heart of the Jewish religion, are not to be conditioned upon the belief of its beneficiaries. Why? Because God's face right now is hidden. And according to Rabbi Sachs, the reason these laws are called Darkei Shalom is because they are alluding to the verse in the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, chapter 3, verse 17, Darchecho darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom. Her ways are ways of pleasantness and all her paths are peaceful. In other words, the rabbinic obligation to extend kindness even to idolaters is actually the very essence of the Torah itself, according to Rabbi Sachs. You see, Rabbi Sachs was orthodox enough to believe that the 5 books of Moses represent the unchanging constitution of the Jewish people given by God to Moshe at Sinai. But he was also enlightened enough to recognize that the revelation itself unfolds over time, right? So what the rabbis did when they formulated these laws of Darkei Shalom was, in a sense, to delve deeper into the spirit of the Torah than had been done beforehand. So if you were to read the Bible without the rabbinic interpretations, you might think, oh, we're allowed to be really horrible to idol worshippers. It was the rabbis who reveal a deeper depth of Torah, which, according to Rabbi Sachs, is really its beating heart, which is ethical all the way down. And until the coming of the Messiah, when monotheism will be clear to everybody, we have no right to condition the love and kindness that we extend to Gentiles upon their having the right theological beliefs. What I'm quoting from is or at least kind of paraphrasing, is chapter 8 of his tremendous book, published in 2005, To Heal a Fractured World. And one of the remarkable things about that book, and I think it's a good book to focus on in a talk like today, is it really articulates and illuminates the uniqueness of Rabbi Sachs on the contemporary Jewish map, because the book is a critique of those on his left and those on his right. To those on his left, the book says, look, there are plenty of Jews who take their Jewish identity as a call to fervent activism in the name of social justice. You know, Einstein says he thanks his lucky stars that he was born a Jew. He talks about some of the things that his Jewish identity gave him, and one of them was an almost fanatical love of justice. And you do see that on the left of the Jewish map, people who might not be all that observant when it comes to religious law and might not spend all that much time in ritual or learning. I think we are disproportionately represented in various fights for justice. You look at the civil rights movement in the United States, it was by no means a majority of rabbinic leadership or Jews were putting their necks on the line to oppose Jim Crow laws and segregation and the suppression of voter rights. But I would say a disproportionately large number of Jews were involved in the struggle. You could say a similar thing about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. By no means was it a majority of the Jewish community who engaged actively in the struggle, but it was a disproportionate number of the white activists against apartheid were Jews, secular Jews on the whole. But Rabbi Sachs turns to them and says, that's great, but it's not enough. And it's not enough for 2 reasons. For reason number 1, Rabbi Sachs believed, and he believed this from personal experience, that a human doesn't reach full flourishing unless he or she lives his or her life in the presence of Hashem. And he just thought that people whose Jewish identity was only about social activism were missing out on something tremendously important. But secondly, and perhaps more to the point, Rabbi Sachs thought that ritual observance is actually a necessary part of living the ethical life when done right. And in his inimitable turn of phrase and with his tremendous facility for analogy, he wrote in To Heal the Fractured World, "Ritual is to ethics what physical exercise is to health. Medical knowledge alone will not make me healthy. That requires daily discipline, a ritual, and religion is the matrix of ritual." I mean, he could only speak for himself, but he said he couldn't be sure that if it weren't for the fact that he prayed 3 times a day, that every single day he would have the discipline to take some time out of his professional life and of whatever other obligations were in the way, and to concentrate on the needs faced by humanity, and to concentrate on the fact that he isn't the center of the universe and that there is a greater other, a transcendent goodness, and so on and so forth. So for him, ritual was a type of spiritual exercise that allowed a person to live not just a life of more kind of religious flourishing, but even when done right, a more ethical flourishing. But in the same breath, or at least in the same book, he turns to those on the religious right and he says, you know, it's all very well for you to be proud of halachic obedience, of kind of fastidious observance of ritual and social conformity. But how can a person take pride in their care never to mix wool and linen and only to eat the most strictly supervised kosher food if they don't care about the plight of refugees and climate change? You know, have they forgotten that Darkei Shalom is the very beating heart of the Torah? Have they forgotten that every single detail of the Torah is, quote, included solely for the sake of ethical and spiritual instruction, as we said? So Rabbi Sachs was this unique figure on the kind of Jewish map because he thought that social action without ritual and theology lacks soul and it lacks kedusha. It lacks at least a certain type of holiness. But he thought that rote halachic observance without a keen and burning ethical sensitivity and sensibility was equally soulless, you know, you know, Rabbi Sachs was calling on both sides of that divide to learn something from the other. And these are not easy lessons to learn. So let me say something briefly about my personal relationship with the rabbi. One of the things that Rabbi Sachs teaches a lot and writes a lot about, it's something that his rabbi, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, the Rosh Yeshiva of Birkat Moshe, the Hesder Yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim, who was the head of Jews College for 12 years in London, with whom Rabbi Sachs learned for over a decade. They learned Talmud Be'iyun together. What they share, Rav Rabinovich and Rabbi Sachs, is this view that's quite theologically daring, but it's the view that God has faith, not just belief. Faith would be the right word, that God has faith in us. I could say more about that, but I want to talk about how that translated into my life and my experiences with him. You see, Rabbi Sachs, I think, tried hard to mirror the faith that he believed God to have in everybody by himself expressing great faith in his students and in his followers and in those who turn to him. And I think he himself had faith that that faith would kind of be redemptive and help people to live up to their potential. He said of himself, and this is why I come back to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I said I would towards the end. He said of himself that his life was shaped by a handful of individuals who had more faith in him than he had in himself. I think the Lubavitcher Rebbe was one of them. I think Rabbi Soloveitchik was one of them. Rav Nachum Rabinovich was one of them. And I felt that from Rabbi Sachs. I felt that Rabbi Sachs had more faith in me than I had in myself. in the aftermath of the controversy surrounding the first edition of The Dignity of Difference, a controversy I'd be happy to talk about sometime, perhaps another time, Rabbi Adam. I was in yeshiva in Israel at that time, and I was blessed to be studying Talmud with this tremendous thinker and educator of Rabbi Shmuel Nachum. But the wider environment in that yeshiva at that time was toxic. And I'd go so far as to say that I was being bullied by some rabbis. And moreover, those rabbis were publicly defaming Rabbi Sacks, calling him a heretic and all sorts. One of them went so far as to go around the Bet Midrash, the study hall, and take his books away from people's seats and to stand on them as a public kind of performance of his disregard. And I felt really crushed and victimized. But because Rabbi Sacks was my hero even then, and we didn't have a personal relationship yet. But on the other hand, I knew I'd be unlikely ever to have another opportunity to learn Talmud from a teacher like Rabbi Nachum and to concentrate all of my time before the responsibilities of marriage, fatherhood, and career to the study of Talmud and Torah. So I wrote to Rabbi Sacks, and I held nothing back. I told him the whole story. I told him exactly what people were saying about him, about his book, how much it was hurting me. And I asked him what I should do. And I'll just read you briefly something from his email back to me. He said, like I said, he didn't know me yet. He said, "Do not come home at this stage, please. It would be the wrong decision. Please feel free to email me whenever you feel the need." I think he felt that he could provide for me the sort of support from a distance that would make me feel less alienated, and that would allow me to carry on my studies in this very special class that I was in. And then he said words which still move me greatly to this day. "One day the Jewish people will be proud to have one such as you, and Hashem will surely give you, in the fullness of time, the right Rebbeim and Chaverim, teachers and friends, as well as the opportunities to use all those facilities to the full, which you now feel are, in Milton's words, lodged with me useless." These are really, really beautiful words to receive from a person's hero. And I wonder, I spoke about how shy he was, but I think he had so many deeply important personal relationships with so many people. He was the sort of person, a little bit like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, to tell you the truth, that one or two conversations with him could shape your entire life. In another email he wrote to me, "You have my full encouragement. May you be guided by one simple principle. May all you do be a Kiddush Hashem. Let's continue the conversation. You are destined for great things, and Hashem surely wishes you to use your gifts to bring people close to him." And I think in these emails, he shows you, or he shows me, what it means for a rabbi to express faith, to articulate faith in the potential of one's students, in the potential of one's followers, and one's congregants, one's family. And that faith which he believed God had in each and every one of us. And it does continue to inspire me. You know, I have days where my self-esteem has been battered by constant academic rejections, or I don't think things are going well. And I just remember Rabbi Sacks really believed I could amount to something, and that's useful, you know. And Rabbi Sacks thought it because he thought God thought it. Right? Every day you wake up, you have to recognize that God is expressing a certain amount of faith in you. He's saying, you know, I'm giving you at least another day because I believe you can turn this around, even if things haven't been great up until now. I'll just say quickly before I stop, have some questions. I've probably run over anyway, but Rabbi Sacks was the first person for whom I taught Kriya. And my kids, so, you know, when you tear your clothing for mourning, there's a halacha to do that for next of kin, very close relatives, but also for your principal rabbis. And my children have seen how grief-stricken I was. And my 9-year-old daughter and I decided that we'd start reading instead of a bedtime story. There's this, you know, a lot of Rabbi Sacks's books are quite formidable, not so easy. I mean, they're beautifully written, but they're not for 9-year-olds. But there is a book called Celebrating Life, which is this kind of collection of very small articles that were in the newspaper, the national newspaper in England. And they're full of anecdotes and jokes and insights. So I was reading them to Hadassah. And we got to one chapter that discusses the the tremendous empirical evidence there is to suggest a correlation between longevity and religious devotion. And as I was reading it, Hadassah looked up at me and she said, "But Dad, Rabbi Sacks didn't live an extremely long life." And she was right. And I didn't know what to say. But I carried on reading, and Rabbi Sacks went on to answer us both. He said, longevity isn't really what matters. It's very nice if religious devotion provides it, but it's not the point. And I'll quote what he said. He said, "Whether or not religious faith makes us live longer, it lets us live each day to the full. Faith is about how we live, not how long." And Rabbi Sacks was a man, like I said, who wrote 28 books in 28 years. He was a man who used his time tremendously well. As I read those words, I really felt that it was as if he was wiping tears from my face, and he was telling me that he was fine. He'd lived his life well, and he'd packed each day with meaning, significance, and achievement. He, I would say, was the very epitome of what the Zohar understands as Babi Yamim, comely of days. We read in last week's parsha that Avraham was elderly, comely of days. Avraham Zakein, Babi Yamim. According to the Zohar, this means that Abraham literally came dressed in his days as if they were an item of clothing. Each and every day of Abraham's life was a testimony to his righteousness. He wore each day as a badge of honor. So Rabbi Sacks, as an energetic and passionate 72-year-old, was far from being old. He wasn't Zaken, but he was certainly Babi Yamim. We were blessed to live in his door, in his generation. He was an unparalleled spokesman for the Jewish people. I really don't believe that from Avraham and Sarah until today, there was another leading rabbinic figure who expressed the truths of Torah to such a wide audience, both in the Jewish world and outside it, from Windsor Castle to Lambeth Palace, from the Dalai Lama to the Pope, kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, and to every Jewish community pretty much around the world. He was a prince of Judah, speaking words of Torah in the amphitheaters of the West, just like the Gemara says in Megillah, in the end of days, the princes of Judah will teach Torah in the great amphitheaters of Edom. So we were blessed to live in his generation. And I think, just to round it all off, I think he would say to us, and I've said this on a number of occasions, he wouldn't want his memory merely to be a blessing. He would want it to be a challenge. He would want us to read his works and to figure out, hey, do I do enough on the social action front? Not just to Jews, but to Gentiles, in terms of the charity I give, the time I donate, the causes that I'm active in. And he'd also ask us to think, are we living the fullest life we can in terms of our relationship with God, in terms of our ritual discipline that enables us to live our lives in the presence of God's majesty? And it's a challenge. It should be a challenge for all of us. And I know that he'd also have faith in us that we can live up to the challenge. So thank you for allowing me to share some of these insights and memories. It was a pleasure to be invited. And I have to tell you, it's a comfort just to be able to speak about my Rebbe at this time.
Rabbi Sam, wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. You know, unfortunately, it's the second time I heard you eulogize one of your teachers. You know, the shir you gave about Rav Lichtenstein was incredible for those interested. It's in YU Torah. And that was just amazingly beautiful.
Thank you.
I just want to take this opportunity. I'll put in the chat. Rabbi Sam posted an article with his thoughts about Rabbi Sacks. Some of what he shared today, you know, this was did much more justice than the article. But the article's available on the Lair House. I'll try to post it in the chat.
The article overlaps with some of the stuff I spoke about Darkei Shalom, but you got to hear more anecdotes and also a human face. but there's actually more material in that article. So if people want to read it, of course.
Right, so I just posted that in the chat. I'll also use this chance to I know Rabbi Sam was too humble. You know, he makes millions of dollars being an academic in Haifa. So he was too humble to take any honorarium for this, but he did just publish a wonderful book, which as I mentioned, had an approbation from Rabbi Sachs. Unfortunately, as an academic book, it's not cheap.
Ridiculously expensive.
But I've heard only the best things about it. I posted there. I assume
Thank
at some point the price will come down, but if
it will, and there will be a book.
Why don't you take 30 seconds and just talk about the book, and then if anyone has any questions, unless you have to run, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure I will. And there is another book coming out with Magid, which I hope will be less expensive, but it's slightly less academically rigorous. The book is my attempt as a contemporary analytical philosopher in the world of non-Jewish secular philosophy, to articulate what I take to be the most fundamental principles of Judaism, the principles that Judaism couldn't do without, that an Orthodox Judaism couldn't do without. This is something that medieval rabbis also engaged in. For instance, the 13 principles of Maimonides' faith, the 3 principles of Yosef Albo's Sefer Ikarim. But the main job of the book is to show what the philosophical ramifications of those 3 principles are, and to try to come at the most kind of philosophically pleasing or plausible articulation of them. So that's what the book is, the principles of Judaism. So the first section is all about the creation, what it means to believe that God created the world, what it means to believe that you are a creation. The second section looks at revelation. What does it mean to believe that the Torah is God's law? Minimally, what must we believe in order to make sense of that in a way that kind of justifies or animates an Orthodox Jewish lifestyle? And the third principle is about redemption and providence, and what we have to believe in order to make sense of Jewish claims about that too. So those are the 3 parts of the book, the principles of Judaism. It is ridiculously expensive. If you are blessed with having 2 kidneys and you sell one of them, you might be able to have a read. Otherwise, it will come out in paperback at some point, I truly hope. And the Magid book as well will be more affordable.
All right, thank you so much. I will open it up to questions. Feel free to post in the chat, or I guess I can let people unmute themselves if I can figure out how to do that. Let me try. Sam, you have a few more minutes?
Yeah, of course I do, yeah.
Let me see if I can, wrong button.
So, Rabbi Sam,
Hi.
I'm a fan of yours via Joe Wolfson 929 voting project that I've been on since the beginning with Rabbi Joe, who I know through my son.
I see. He's a phenomenon, Joe Wolfson.
Yeah, phenomenal. And you spoke beautifully today.
Thank you.
Your ability to concretize Rabbi Sachs's message and meaning so quickly after his such untimely passing, which was just a shock to me, to the rest of the world. I mean, and in the middle of his last book, unfortunately, saying that is difficult, which I had bought maybe 6 weeks before his passing, and really a message for our current time that we're currently in, and the way you so eloquently mentioned about his synthesis of social action and Torah together. And as you said, he really is a very, very unique individual within the Orthodox community that can put together kind of both sides of that coin. We see many who can handle one, many who can handle the other, but him really together, and especially in our time now with such deep polarization within our community, his message is very, very timely and together. And you yourself, whether it's your beautiful British accent or just your other words that you say about him, should continue to carry on his message and meaning going forward. So thank you for your words today.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah, I feel his absence very, very painfully, but I know that if we continue to try to live out his teachings, the kind of pain of that absence will subside and even transform into just a feeling of gratefulness that we had his leadership
That's
for as long as we did.
Merit to him is to learn his Torah and
absolutely
carry on his memory in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I see on the chat, Stephanie Swerdlow said, I don't know if this is appropriate, but what would Rabbi Sachs say about today's world where Jewish people are so at war with each other politically? It's a great question. Rabbi Sachs was really, really worried about this latterly. I mean, right throughout his career. I mean, the fact that it's called Covenant and Conversation, he was very, very eager to promote civilized discourse. That's also part of the dignity of difference. Being able to listen, truly listen, was what he thought was one of the most important Jewish kind of notions. That's why Shema Yisrael, that we tell ourselves twice a day, every day, we have to remember what it means really to listen to another. We can't hope to hear the voice of God properly if we're not really able to hear the voice of another properly. So one thing that he would, I think, ask us to do in these very polarized times is to practice real and deep listening, trying to understand where the other is coming from. And we don't do that enough. He was also very worried about popularism, both on the right and on the left. On the left, he spoke about the danger of safe spaces in university, where it's obviously appropriate that we should care about the vulnerable when we teach, and that we should want not to harm anybody or make vulnerable people more vulnerable through what we say and how we say it. But equally, it's of tremendous importance that as we provide an education on our campuses, we don't feel bullied into submission when it comes to the freedom of speech and the freedom of inquiry and the freedom to pursue research in whichever directions it leads, in the safe knowledge that we will be scrutinized and criticized courteously by our peers. He was very worried that this was shutting down on campus because of a type of identity politics that he thought was dangerous. But likewise, he saw real danger in the popularism of the right, with its kind of increasing disregard for evidence and expertise, facts. We're living in a post-truth era on the right and a postmodernist era on the left, and both of them, I think, he thought were pernicious. What we need to do is learn to listen to one another without silencing the other. And I think Rabbi Sacks would have continued to address these issues more if only he had been given longer. But it was certainly something that he was beginning to address more vocally, but it was always there in his teachings, this notion of attentive and deep listening. Any other questions?
All right. Thank you so much again. Wonderful to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure we'll find an opportunity soon enough to have you back.
I would like that. Thank you so much. Really, it was really nice of you to share your time and your lunch with me. Thank you.
All the
Take
best.
care.
Be well.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Adam. Bye.